Well, has life pranked you and you've tried to vent your dipstick and you've had nothing but problems, and you've wasted money on a fueling dipstick and you've had nothing but problems? I'm not laughing. Are you? I was going to vent my dipstick using this. After a lot of research, I've seen a lot of people have had problems getting oil all over. It's just not a good idea. So I am going to vent through the transmission top cover. And I've seen a lot of people put an external breather on their intake with the ports, with the little catch can, whatever, underneath. And what I'm finding out is that's a bad idea too. You need the vacuum in the motor because it helps with the rings, helps with air in the oil. You need to keep the motor in a vacuum state. So putting a catch can and bypassing and putting an external breather is a bad thing to do. Here's a quick video, about 10 minutes, by Kevin Baxter at Baxter's Garage. He really does a great job explaining why you don't want to do that external breather here. And you really don't want to do this here because it's nothing but problems with oil. So we're going to go through the transmission top cover. Check out this video and we'll get back to what we're doing here.
1960s. And any of you guys that are hot rod guys will remember in the 60s and before, pretty much every vehicle on the road, the engine was vented to atmosphere. The crankcase was vented to atmosphere through the valve covers. Okay, they just had breathers on top of them. And if any of you remember, one of the biggest problem during the 60s was oil consumption. And that's where the habit came from. You'd pull into a service station and they would check your oil every time you filled up your tank. You can't get full service gas stations anymore, unfortunately. But that was the thing, and people knew that you needed to check your oil on a regular basis because consumption was a big problem. So let's think of how they combated that. The first emissions control device to be put on a vehicle was a PCV valve. Positive crankcase ventilation is what it stands for. And it's this little weighted valve, and that would typically connect to manifold vacuum. All right, so the purpose of that was so that it would put the crankcase in a vacuum environment. All right, what they discovered was by putting the crankcase in a vacuum environment, it actually helped the lower piston ring seal better. All right, because it would create that pressure and almost suck the piston out. Okay, and that to a large degree, and I'm sure I've got car guys in here that will remember this stuff, just to confirm for everybody else watching what I'm telling you, that when they started putting PCV valves on cars, then the oil consumption problem was drastically reduced. Okay, so what you were doing to a large degree was negative crankcase pressure to help the rings seal better. Leland says, I remember it well. Okay, now let's fast forward and let's see how that applies to Harleys. If you owned a shovelhead, panhead, Evo, twin cam, or M8, it doesn't really matter. All of those engines sumped, and let me explain. Any bike that had the oil tank higher than the oil pump. Okay, so like I said, think way back. All right, I'm sure all of you have experienced it. If you own an Evo, Evo, shovel, pan, any of those bikes, if they sit for a while, the oil in the tank would actually not really bypass the pump, but leak through the check valve in the pump and fill up the engine crankcase. Even modern day Sportsters. All right, so that's why they tell you if you have a Softail or a Sportster, you always need to check the oil with the engine hot, because I've seen people do it too many times. They'll check it when it's cold, it looks low. They put oil into the tank, they crank it up, all that oil was sumped into the bottom of the crankcase, and then that oil would suddenly get pumped back into the oil tank and it blows the oil out everywhere. Okay, so sumping really isn't anything new as far as oil filling the crankcase. All right, and Trooper Spirit happened on old British bikes too, something on Triumphs and all this stuff. Guys, this is not anything new. This is kind of the same sort of thing that I see. There seems to be a resurgence on cam chain tensioner issues, the spring-loaded ones from 99 to 06. We're seeing it again only because people are dragging those bikes out of barns and suddenly realizing, oh crap, we need to do this. This stuff isn't anything new, okay? So anyway, let's talk. Evos did the same thing. One of the things that was great about Evos is it had more of a controlled breather system on it, where it actually had it was timed to the crank. It actually had a little breather gear and in there that acted almost as the PCV valve. Okay, so and Evos were great, but they were also much smaller displacement engines. And when you look at pistons from Evos and shovels, particularly, you'll notice that they have very thick oil rings and very thick compression rings on it, like 3mm and bigger oil ring packs and really, really thick compression ring packs. Okay, and those engines also ran lower compression ratios. All right, so on an Evo, having a 9.5 to 10-to-1 compression, Evo is a lot. All right, well, they're not as compression sensitive as twin cams were. Well, that's even more so with the M8s. With a 4-valve head, they're very efficient. So you can run higher compression ratios, 10-8, 11, 11-2-to-1, even on 93 octane fuel. Okay, so let's look at the transition again from Evo, lower compression ratio, twin cam compression ratio got higher, strokes also got longer, displacement went up. Now let's look at M8. The breather system is not that much different. The cam plate and oil pump, like I've demonstrated to you guys, and how everything works, is not that different as it was with twin cam. But yet the displacement has gotten bigger, right? Displacement is bigger, and they're turning more RPMs than the Evo did. They're turning more RPMs faster than the Evo did. And so you have higher, all of those things that are, working against it. So that's the transition. And just to demonstrate to you guys, something really isn't anything new, right? But it seems to be the biggest problem with the M8. Now, for guys that were around back in the early twin cam days, we were building 4 and 5/8 stroke twin cams from the very beginning, very early on, 120, 124 cubic inch stuff, way back then. Those engines would sump as well. You had to do things to vent the crankcase. Okay, you had to. I mean, I was making vented dipsticks, and I wasn't the only one. Vented dipsticks for twin cams back in the day because the oil caps weren't threaded; they just pushed in. Well, if you had a little bit of blow by, high compression, high RPM, it would spit the dipstick straight out of the oil pan on the FL models, or well, in the Dyna models too. So it wasn't anything new then. And then we got creative and started doing things. I actually discovered a PCV valve that you could lay sideways. It was a metric application. I think it was a Nissan 4-cylinder or something like that. And what I did was drill and tap into the rocker boxes and put with an 1/8 pipe thread, and then thread that PCV valve into the rocker box. And that solved my issues entirely. Okay, so now let's move into the M8s. Now, okay, here we go. I'm sorry. Let me get something to drink. All right. We know the M8s have a higher compression ratio. Okay. We know, again, everything that we've talked about leading up to this point. The thing we have to consider, the differences between the M8 and the twin cam, you've got some extra components that are in there. One of those components being the balancer. We have to think of what's really happening. There are two causes that can create what I would say sumping. All right, we have an inefficient oil pump, inefficient cam plate, that's one. Second, we have blow-by past the piston rings, all right? Blow-by through the ring, building up crankcase pressure. That will cause sumping. The next thing that can cause it is over-lubrication of the cylinder. All right, now most of the people that are having sumping problems, it's not people that are just riding around, in fairly low RPMs for a short period of time. It's folks that are 2,500, 3,000 RPM and up for 45 minutes to an hour. That's when the sumping starts, really starting to build up, okay? When that sumping builds up, if you look at the belly on an M8 case versus one of a twin cam, there's not quite as much volume there in the base of the M8 case. So what happens when you get only about 4 to 6 ounces in the bottom of the case, it hits the crank. All right, now that wasn't as big of a deal on the twin cam because that was the only component in there that was touching the oil. When you get into the M8s, you have the balancer gear. All right, so what happens is just a little bit of oil gets in there. Several things are going on. A little bit of oil gets up in there, and that gear on the balancer starts picking up that oil as well. And it's slinging the oil everywhere inside the engine case. That oil it's compounding, doing a couple of things. One, it's aerating the oil that's in the crankcase, right? And it's frothing that oil up. That's why when you go on a long ride like that and you pull your dipstick out, have a look at it, you can look down there at the oil and see bubbles in it, right? It's because that balancer is just frothing that oil up. The other thing it does, and the reason you're seeing so much oil and carbon buildup on top of the pistons through the intake track and stuff like that, is because it's the bottom side of the cylinders are also getting over lubricated. So that oil is splashing up onto the cylinder walls, and then you've got the rings that kind of skip over the oil. It's just over lubricating them, all right? And then that oil works its way past the rings onto the pistons. The rings just can't keep up. So then when you start using piston rings that are smaller than the Evo, narrower oil packs, lower tension rings themselves, they can't wipe the oil as efficiently or effectively as the older stuff does. All right, is everybody following me so far? I know I'm throwing a ton of information at you, right? So yeah, cavitation, Darryl Dempsey, that's the magic science word. It's cavitating the oil, right? So it's over lubricating the cylinders, pushing that oil on top, and everything else. Now here's an interesting conundrum. Okay, let's look. And the reason I mentioned this stuff about the 60s, we already know that the crankcase being in a vacuum environment does a couple of different things. It reduces the cavitation. If it's in a vacuum environment, it's harder for fluids to absorb air and bubble. That's why if you take a fluid that has air bubbles all in it and you put a vacuum on it, it'll suck the bubbles out of that fluid, right? So by keeping it in a vacuum environment, that helps that issue. The second things, we already know past emissions history from the 60s that if you put the crankcase in a vacuum environment, that it helps the rings seal better. Okay, this is a no-brainer. This is engine 101 stuff. All right, so we're in an interesting conundrum with the M8s because the engine displacements have gotten huge. The cam plates and oil pumps are becoming even, more and more, trying to get more and more efficient, but it's hard for a pump to deal with the cavitation issue. It can't maintain suction over a period of time. So I'm in an interesting place with this dilemma. I like the idea of venting the heads. You've seen several people are doing that. They're taking the heads and they're venting it to atmosphere, okay, bypassing the intake and dropping the hose down. Well, on one side of that, that's good, because if you have blow-by and something issues, that prevents that over lubrication on the cylinder wall and the oil that gets around it and all that stuff from being sucked back into the intake, right? That's a good thing. However, you're also removing the engine's ability to put the crankcase into a vacuum environment, which helps seal the rings. Okay? Everybody understand where I'm at there? So that's one of the downsides to venting at the breather, okay, is you're removing that vacuum ability. It's okay because you still have the umbrella valve or PCV valve to prevent it, from sucking air back in, but you're also not pulling a vacuum on it, right? Well, the other issue with running a vented dipstick is the fact that you're venting it. You're releasing that vacuum, right? So it's basically almost turning it into a free breather. So I'm saying that there's pros and cons with doing it either way. It seems like one is a trade-off for the other, and you kind of have to do them both.
That's a pretty good video by Kevin Baxter. Now, if you want to waste the money and spend some money, the Trask transmission top cover with the vent already installed is the way to go. That's like 300 bucks. I would get that or a Fueling dipstick. I think that's just a waste of money. Or you can do it my way for 20 bucks, and we're gonna vent it ourselves. But the Trask Performance, that's like 300 bucks, but it might be worth it if you got the money. But let's do it my way. I went to C&M Model as if this ain't the cutest little tool ever. Yeah, these are supposed to be torqued back down to like 110 inch-pounds. And I don't know if that's happening, but we'll put them nice and snug tight. Not too tight, you know, because they ain't getting no torque wrench in here. Let's see what's under this cap here. We're going to be drilling a hole about right there. Let's see what we got here. I see the vent, and that basically goes right through the center. Let's see what we got here. So this vent, I see there's a little vent hole here, and then it comes out through this little hole here, which vents through here. We need to vent another hole through here. Here's a quick video, little explanation of each port here. It's like 10 seconds. But so I'll give you a little explanation of what's going on here. Well, I'll get an X-Acto knife and figure out how to put a hole in here.
This section here is the transmission. Your gear sets and all that are down in there. This center section is the transmission vent on the cover. And this third section over here on the right side of the bike is the air bypass from the engine to the oil tank. And I'll get a mirror so you can actually see the ports. Okay, so there's the hole or the port that goes down into the, connects to the engine case for the engine to breathe into this cavity. And here over at the rear of the transmission pocket is the hole that goes down to the oil tank on the bottom of the bike. So it transfers air from the front, from the engine back to the oil tank via this cavity.
Well, I worked it very carefully, so I got this to come out, which is nice because I'm going to put a hole right next to that hole right there. Alright, I'm glad I got this out. So, see if we can make an exact same hole on the other side here. Right about here. Alright. As low as possible in case fluid does come down. So yeah, right in there. I'll do this. I'm gonna do it this way. I'm gonna burn a hole nice and brown. So next week or so, I'm not sure when, I'm gonna put a cam in this bike, and this should solve all the something problems. I should have no issues with moving up stage. They say, you know, stage 1, 2, 3, or 4. You should have no issues, you know. Putting this extra breather is going to help a lot of issues. So I think I'm going to go this route, and we're going to burn a nice hole in this gasket. Right here. I'll be back. Oh, this is what I got. This is actually metal. I'm going to have to file this down on this side a little bit. So yeah, I'm hoping this helps with the sumping issues, and once I get this cam put in, so this should help with the, you know, if you're doing a one stage 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, take some of that pressure out of the motor, but yeah, keeping it in a vacuum state and helping with the sumping issue. So this is actually metal, so I'm gonna have to file that down a little bit, but I think that's gonna be good enough just to help with some of that pressure. This sweet, cute little filing kit. I think we want you. Nice round file. Do a little filing, get this smoothed out. We don't want no metal chunks. And we will be back. So what I used a voltmeter, power tester to get the hole started, and then I filed it so there's no shavings on the rough edges. Make sure I get this clean before I put it back in. But yeah, they're about, after filing, they're about the same size, those holes now. So now we gotta drill a hole in the top cover and go from there. All right, that looks pretty good. Try not to mess it up too much. There we go. Now we drill a hole. I might go through this side first and then, yeah. That's metal. Yeah, we'll start small. Now I flipped it over and I'm going slow, a little bit at a time, because I'm hoping I can self-thread. I thought this was plastic, but it's metal, so I might have to go get a tapper. I got super lucky, and it's starting to thread in. The metal's so soft. Huh. Super lucky. I'm gonna thread it in, thread it out, get some thread started, and then put some sealer in there after I get that done. I don't know how I got so lucky, but that threaded in perfectly. And I mean perfect. So I'm gonna take it back out. Put a little gasket sealer in there, thread it back in. Oh, it made perfect threads. Beautiful. All right, moving on. I'm not just saying this, but black Permatex is the best. Sometimes you just gotta poke a new hole, but that's all right. For this being open, I was just thinking like, wow, that's really clean, and like really no oil gets up in there, So that's pretty good. Yeah, I love this stuff. Gotta get the black. Gotta get the black. We're gonna thread that in. Nice and tight and done. Alright, she's threaded in and it goes on nice and tight. Yeah, it's tight. Perfect. Alright, I'm gonna put her back on. Alright, got the gasket in place. She's looking good, nice and cleaned up. Now I got the new cover on, make sure it's nice and clean. Alright, we are gonna bolt her back down. Alright, just about got it. It takes longer to take this on and off than it does to do the whole job. I did put a little bit of blue Loctite on these. Not much, just a little. And I'm not giving it a whole lot. I mean, it's right here. I'm gonna just a little turn. And that's good enough. You don't need a whole lot. Not super tight, just, nice snug tight. And there we go. Next. All right, this I got at, I don't know, parts store, O'Reilly's, whatever. This is 3/8, so I got 3/8 in here. The line is 1/4 inch. So I took a heat gun, I heated it up, and I forced it over the 3/8. 3/8 going in, 3/8 here, 1/4 inch line going. And I picked up these different sizes. I'm gonna put one here and then one on the end. Make it look a little better than having these. Now I took off the saddlebag and the seat. Now let's figure out how I'm gonna route this. Basically they're just clamps. I don't know, this kit came with a bunch of different sizes. So I put one here for the 3/8 and then for the 1/4 inch. So I get that on. Yeah, it'll look better than having these big old gaudy clamps on there. All right, let's get it in. Okay, I got it on there. Got the clamp. Basically went up under the battery box. Around by the battery box. She's right there. She'll be covered by the side panel. Put the seat back on. She's done. She's vented. And we are ready for the cam next week. So yeah, check out Baxter's Garage, Kevin Baxter. I'll put his number in here. He seems to know his stuff. Like, subscribe, and check him out. Give him a call. Tell him I sent you, and give you the family discount. All right, thanks.